Hello everyone and welcome back to Canadian King Coins. In today's video, I'll be going over the history of Canadian $1 banknotes, both the older Dominion of Canada notes and the more modern Bank of Canada notes. Now of course, everyone knows about the world-famous loonie, Canada's $1 coin, which was introduced in 1987. But before those came into use, Canada used the dollar bill, just like the good old USA. The Bank of Canada is Canada's central bank and issuer of all of Canada's banknotes since it opened its doors in 1935. But before that, issuing banknotes was the responsibility of the Dominion government. Now, I don't have many of these old notes as they can be very expensive, but the first dollar bill came in the first issue of currency after Confederation in 1870. The next issue came in 1878, then again in 1897 and 1898. The oldest $1 bill I do have is from the next issue, from 1911. Pictured on the bill are the Earl and Countess of Grey. The Earl was Governor-General of Canada from 1904 to 1911. The reverse features Canada's original Parliament buildings. And there are actually two varieties for this note. One with a black line above the signatures here, and one with a green line, like this one. The green line ones are worth a bit more. The next issue came just a few years later in 1917. This was the only banknote Canada would produce during World War I. It features Princess Patricia, who was the daughter of the Governor-General of Canada at the time, the Duke of Connaught. The reverse again features the original Canadian Parliament buildings, which were actually destroyed in a fire in 1916, so interestingly, no longer existed at the time of issue. There were three varieties for this issue, all pertaining to the seal at the right of the note. The first variety contains just the word 1 with no seal. The next has a seal over the word 1, which is the variety I have here, and the next has just the seal. The next and last issue of the Dominion of Canada $1 notes came in 1923. Featured is King George V on the obverse, and the Library of Parliament on the reverse. The Library of Parliament was the only centre block building to survive the fire a few years earlier due to its heavy steel doors, and it is absolutely beautiful on the inside. The varieties for this note again come from the seals. There were 6 different colored seals produced for this note: black, red, blue, green, bronze, and purple, with black being the most common. Then, in 1935, the Bank of Canada was created, becoming Canada's central bank and given the sole responsibility of issuing Canada's paper currency, with the Royal Canadian Mint making the coins. The first issue of notes came the same year, in 1935. All of these notes were made significantly smaller, to roughly the size of American notes, which has changed very slightly ever since. Featured again on the obverse is King George V, and on the reverse is an allegory representing agriculture. For the 1935 series, separate English and French notes were issued. King George V died in early 1936, and after the brief reign and subsequent abdication of King Edward VIII, new banknotes were needed for the new king, George VI. A design for the new banknotes had already been drafted featuring Edward VIII, but of course never went into production, so it was very easy switching out the portrait on the obverse, and the new notes were issued in 1937. This issue was now completely bilingual, with English on the left and French on the right. The allegory on the reverse remained the same. King George VI died in 1952, and his daughter was crowned Queen Elizabeth II. You might have heard of her. A new issue of Canadian currency was prepared, but this time it was completely redesigned from the previous issue. The notes were issued in 1954, and the obverse featured the Queen, and the reverse now featured a beautiful prairie scene. These notes remained in production until 1967, when, as part of the centennial celebrations, special $1 bills were issued. These were largely the same as the 1954 issue, except for some wording changes and the addition of the centennial logo to the left. The prairie scene in the reverse was replaced with a view of the original Parliament buildings. In addition to the regular circulation issue of the note, a special collector edition of the note was produced and could be purchased from the Bank of Canada at the time for face value. Instead of a serial number, this note featured the double dates 1867 to 1967. Nowadays, this version is actually more common than the circulation issue. The next and final issue of the Canadian $1 bill came in 1973. This issue featured a slightly older Queen Elizabeth II on the obverse, and a beautiful scene of the Ottawa River with the Parliament buildings in the background on the reverse. This issue actually looks a lot more yellow than the previous issue's green. This issue would continue to be produced until 1989, 2 years after the introduction of the loonie $1 coins in 1987. The success of the coins simply drove the banknotes into redundancy. Billions of these notes were produced, and even mint state examples of these notes are only a few dollars each. $1 banknotes are virtually never seen in circulation today, having been completely replaced by the coin over the 30 years since the introduction of the loonie. Now, if only we could get the US to do the same. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video on the history of Canadian $1 banknotes, a rather obscure piece of Canadian history. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing, or checking out some of the other videos on my channel where I've covered many Canadian coins. And as always, have a great day.